Welcome to Candid Conversation number 476. Today's question: what does the term shake the dust off your feet mean? Why does that mention in the Bible? Shake the dust off your feet. Well, I believe it's first mentioned in Scripture in Matthew chapter 10. Jesus told his disciples, go not into the way of the Gentiles or the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And they are go from city to city to preach the gospel of the kingdom to them. Do signs and wonders during that at-hand phase of the kingdom. Preach the gospel of the kingdom to them. And he says, if you come to a city and they don't accept you, he says, just shake the dust off your feet and go to the next city, because you won't have finished going over all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man become, before the second coming of Christ. So then you've also got, I believe Paul says it over in the book of Acts. Well, I don't know if Paul says it, but it says, it gives a comment that when the message of the gospel that he preached in a certain city was rejected, it says then Paul shook the dust off his feet and went to another city. So from those references, we know that shaking the dust off your feet is a reference to, it's a reference to going into a city, the people of the city, you preach the gospel, the people of the city do not believe the gospel. And so shaking the dust off your feet is a way to move on to the next city or the next church, synagogue, or wherever it is, and preach the gospel there. So that's what the term means, shake the dust off your feet. Now, you may say, well, why did they use that? You know, it seems kind of a weird language to use. Why would you say shake the dust off your feet? Well, the answer has to do with, I believe it has to do with the fact that we are in a sin-cursed world. I'll tell you also over in Isaiah, it says, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach glad tidings. Those who preach the gospel are said to have beautiful feet. And then it says, shake the dust off your feet if they don't believe the gospel. So I think of verses like Jesus says, or God says, I should say, in Genesis 4, when Cain killed Abel, it says, the blood of your brother Abel, God told Cain that the blood of your brother crieth to me from the ground. And so it seems like you got Romans 8 mentions how the whole world groaneth and travaileth, waiting for the redemption, waiting for the sons of God to be made manifest. So basically the world, the earth, is under the curse of sin. And the ground is polluted, I guess spiritually speaking, with righteous blood. And whenever you don't believe the gospel, when Paul or the disciples go out to a city, preach the gospel, and it's rejected, whenever they don't believe that gospel, then it's like it pollutes the ground, so to speak. It's a polluted land. A lot of times in the Old Testament, God will say, I'm coming against the land of Moab or Babylon or Egypt. He says he's going to destroy the land. When Israel did not observe the Sabbath years, they went into 70 years of Babylonian captivity. It said, so the land may rest, enjoy the Sabbath years. So just various scriptures like that tell you that whenever someone believes the gospel or they don't believe the gospel, it affects the land. When people sin, they kill people. That it makes the blood of the land and the creation, the earth, groans and travails over the sin of man that it has had to absorb over the years. When you die, your body goes back to dust. When Adam sinned, God says, dust, you are made from the dust, and you're going to go back to the dust. And the earth has to absorb that. And so, in my opinion, what I think is going on is that when believing Israel would go from city to city in Israel, or Paul went to a city, preached the gospel, and that city rejects the gospel, they have beautiful feet because they preach the gospel. They are bringing good things to the land. The land can be healed, so to speak, by the inhabitants of the land believing the gospel. But if they don't believe the gospel, God says, you have judged yourself unworthy of everlasting life. You don't receive everlasting life, and it's like the land has to absorb the death of those people because they will die in their sins, and the sins are going to sort of be absorbed by the land. That's what I get, from the fact that Abel's blood, cries to God from the ground. Here's a polluted land, and here's righteous blood, so it cries from there. And so I think shaking the dust off your feet is just really it shows that the land is going to be judged for its sin. God will have to destroy the inhabitants of that land, wipe the land clean. And then that also goes along with in eternity, God says he's going to have a new heaven and a new earth. So, and it's not that God just completely throws away the earth and pops a new one back in, but it shows that what God does is he cleanses the land from its sin, its iniquity. But until that time, the land is unclean. And so when they judge themselves unworthy of everlasting life, then the land there is unclean. And if the people come in with beautiful feet, meaning they are holy people because they believe the gospel, and that gospel is rejected, then the land, it's like the land absorbs the iniquity or sin of unbelief. And so then it would affect the people that had gone to the city. And so Jesus says, shake the dust off your feet. Shake that off your feet. In other words, don't allow their unbelief to pollute you, and then go to the next city. And it's interesting also in relation to that, and I believe it's John chapter 13. I know it's the book of John. It's somewhere around 13. It could be 14, but I think it's John 13. Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And he says, basically, the reason he does that, why are you just washing the feet? Peter says, you're not going to wash my feet. You're my Lord. You shouldn't serve me. And Jesus says, well, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part in me. And Peter says, oh, well, wash my feet and my hands and my head. Wash everything. I want to have part in you. And he says, well, you're clean. You're clean every whit except for your feet. And you think, well, why is that? Why the feet? Well, it's because when they believe the gospel, God says they are clean. And so they will go in to the kingdom as cleansed Israel, believing Israel, going into that kingdom. But their feet, because their feet have been walking from city to city in Israel, and the cities reject the gospel, then the land absorbs that sin or that wickedness. And so then their feet then are polluted. They're beautiful feet when they come in because they're proclaiming the gospel. They are going to restore the land, basically. But when they leave, when the land rejects the gospel, the people in there reject the gospel, well, now their feet aren't beautiful anymore because they're polluted by the wickedness or the sin of unbelief of those people. And so God says, shake the dust off your feet. Try to get it off. But when you do that, if you're walking on dirt, you can shake the dust off your feet, and so when you leave, you get from dirt to pavement or something else. Well, your feet, you shake the dust off so it's not as dirty as it was. But to fully get all that dust off of your feet, you have to cleanse it. you'd have to wash it with water to get rid of the dirt completely. And so I think the reason for the foot washing in John 13, why Jesus says, well, I'm going to wash your feet, but he doesn't wash their hands, their head, anything else. He says you're clean. It's because God has cleansed them, their whole bodies, but their feet become dirty or polluted from the unbelief of the cities they go to. And so before they can enter the kingdom, then their feet have to be washed from the pollution of the world, the wickedness of the people not believing the gospel. So I think that's why you've got that, the washing of the feet, and shaking the dust off your feet and then washing the feet afterward as a result. There was something else I was going to say about that. Another connection. And it's gone. But yeah, basically that's where the foot washing comes in. The church that I grew up in, they'd have communion. You know, a lot of churches have, pretty much every church has a communion service, periodically at least. But the church I grew up in, they did communion and feet washing at the same time. There are very few churches that do feet washing. Well, that's what God said to do. You know, wash the feet. He said in John 13 that he washed their feet as an example, and that they need to wash each other's feet. I mean, if you take the Bible literally and you're following Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you know, why don't all the other churches wash each other's feet? Well, it's the same reason why they don't do circumcision, but they do water baptism, is that people are sort of grossed out by washing other people's feet, you know, and you're sort of embarrassed to see the fungus and ingrown toenails and weird stuff that you got going on down there. So they don't want to do that. Just like circumcision, you know, they're fine with dunking you in water for water baptism, but circumcision, physical circumcision, they're not going to do that. You know, so it's the same thing with feet washing. But yeah, that's really why I think he says shake the dust off your feet. It has to do with God cleanses their whole bodies, but then they're polluted by the unbelief of man. And that's, you know, just basically like when God makes the new earth. God has to get rid of all the people who have turned against him, followed the Antichrist. They're all killed. And then after the millennial kingdom is over, those who are still in unbelief, they're killed at the battle of that final battle against Satan in Revelation 20, around verses 6 through 10, somewhere in there, that final battle. And so the earth is cleansed of that, and God brings about the new earth. God doesn't bring about New Jerusalem for Israel until after the millennial reign, because that is when the earth is completely cleansed of sin. So in order to get into the kingdom for Israel, well, the earth is cleansed of sin in that all those who follow the Antichrist are killed in Revelation 19 at Jesus' second coming. And then God says he's going to gather his people. Isaiah 40 talks about he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs in his arm, gently carry them in his bosom. Psalm 23 says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. You know, those types of things. Jesus Christ bringing them into the kingdom. Well, sin cannot enter God's presence. And although the people have believed the gospel, believe in Israel, they believe the gospel and they've been brought in, they're going through land that was been polluted by the blood of all these unbelievers. They'd gone from city to city that had not believed the gospel, and so they had to shake the dust off their feet, and Jesus Christ then ends up washing their feet when they go into the kingdom, so that they are completely whole. Not just, you know, the blood of Christ atones for their sins, so they have the atonement and their soul is completely whole, but then there's the purifying of the flesh as well. They are going to be just like all of us, we're body, soul, and spirit. And for us in the dispensation of grace, we're going to be raptured up and receive new bodies. For those who are alive, we'll be raptured up, receive new bodies. Those who are dead, they're going to receive the new bodies as well. But for the Jews, since they're not actually, they don't go up in the air, their eternal kingdom is on earth, then they have their bodies, they receive the glorified bodies for the kingdom because they receive the atonement. But there's something to do with having to cleanse their feet from the wickedness or the pollution of the unbelievers. Another part of it could be in Revelation 14. It mentions that God's wrath poured out there at Jesus' second coming. And it says that the blood is going up as high as the horses' bridles from all the wicked there. Well, their feet are going to get bloodied from that as well. So, that could be part of the washing of the feet. So basically that's what it has to do with that. But in the dispensation of grace, we're not going from city to city like the apostles were preaching the gospel. And also we're going to get the glorified bodies, and we're going up to heaven. We're not walking through land from wherever we were into where God's throne is going to be on earth. God's just bringing us up into heaven. So that's why the feet washing, you don't need to do that today. But I just think it's funny how churchianity picks and chooses what they want to believe. If you say that we need to follow Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus washes the feet of the disciples and says that this is an example, you need to wash each other's feet, why aren't the churches doing it? I thought you follow what Jesus said in the red letters. Why aren't you doing it? And then they make a big deal out of water baptism. They do that, but circumcision, they don't do that. Jesus was circumcised. You see circumcision over in Acts 16, I believe it is, when Paul is going to take Timothy to go with him to preach the gospel of grace in the new dispensation. Even after the new dispensation has started, he takes Timothy, who was half Jew, half Gentile, was never circumcised, and he circumcises him. Here's a grown man being physically circumcised as late as Acts 16. People will say, oh, well, we should be water baptized today because they water baptized in the book of Acts. The Corinthians were water baptized, and that's in the dispensation of grace, so why don't you do that today? Well, Timothy was circumcised, physically circumcised in Acts 16 after the dispensation of grace began. So why aren't you physically circumcised? Nobody is, carrying the banner for physical circumcision, but churchianity would carry the banner for water baptism, and they won't carry the banner for feet washing. Why are they doing that? Another thing to go along with the washing with water is in Ezekiel 36. It mentions that God is going to put Israel under the new covenant. When Jesus comes back, he atones for their sins. He puts them under that new covenant. And Ezekiel 36 says that, he says, then I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you will be clean. I think that's just a sprinkling of water baptism, but it seems like it goes in with the feet washing. Maybe the sprinkling of water is feet washing. I don't know. But it's interesting that Jesus says you need to wash each other's feet, and if you don't have your feet washed, then you have no part in Christ, because your feet will be dirty going into the kingdom. And as part of the new covenant, God says he's going to sprinkle clean water upon them for them to be clean. So basically that's all I had to say about shaking the dust off your feet. It's just something that has to do with Israel's program going into the kingdom, and because their inheritance is the earth, and they are walking on earth's land that has been contaminated by the unbelief of the unbelief of those different cities of Israel, the different ones they go to, and then subsequently when they're going into Jerusalem after Jesus' second coming in the battle against Antichrist and his forces, then they got all the blood and everything, and so their feet have to be cleansed for that. Whereas today in the dispensation of grace, we are raptured up, receive our glorified bodies, raptured up, meet the Lord in the air. We're not doing any walking on the land. And so there is no mention for us in the dispensation of grace needing to do feet washing or shaking the dust off your feet. So anyway, thanks for watching.